how do I DM? So there's the golden
Yeah,
ticket question right there. Yeah, good question.
yeah.
How do you DM? All
Yeah. Let me know when you figure it out, is what I said.
right.
That was the first thing I said. Good question. But let me know when you figure it out. Um,
That's awesome. You are listening to the Casting Shadows podcast. This is a special bonus episode featuring, well, a comfortable conversation with Webster of Roleplay Rescue as we talk about learning games originally and being a part of other people learning games now, coaching and mentoring. I thought this might be a good topic for us to discuss for three reasons. One, it's a primary interest of mine. How do we learn games better? But more importantly, they are a part of, I guess, the mission statement of Roleplay Rescue. Bringing people back to the game and making that experience easier, allowing for greater confidence and a quicker road to satisfaction. You know, rescuing your lost roleplay hobby. Roleplay Rescue recently celebrated its 5th anniversary, and I had wanted to get this conversation out before then, but as it tends to do, life and scheduling got in the way, so we'll be releasing it today. Another challenge that Che has taken on is being public about men's health, and he participates in Movember. So it's important to me to get this episode out at least during the month of November. And I think that while it may seem to be entirely focused on the idea of anecdotes and stories and commentary about learning games or guiding people in their learning of games, or at least being present to help coach them through some difficult moments or point out some different things that can be tried. While it seems to be mainly about that, there is that aspect of lonely fun in the hobby, which so many people of an age, either just starting out and not knowing anybody, or coming back to the hobby later and not knowing anybody, or having continued to play but leaving so many people along the way that you're the last one left, or at least it feels that way. There can be an isolating sense that games and your interest in games are just your fun, your lonely fun, and become as much a part of your ongoing isolation as they could be the solution. And I find that to be something to speak out against. It is possible to find people to play with. It is possible to get back into and play games. It's possible to play the games that you want to play and not just the games that are easily on offer. That gaming experiences in large public spaces that require great expense and lots of travel and exposure to various diseases and all the other things that can keep people away from conventions aren't the sole means to play. They aren't the center of the hobby. They aren't required of you. That the heart of gaming is connection with friends and family around a table playing these games and exploring the experiences that they produce. And so, in tribute, in recognition, in the spirit of all of that, I wanted to have this conversation and release it. And hopefully, late is better than never. And so, as it's not Roleplay Rescue, my tribute will be this 4 minutes and 6 seconds. I'm here with Jay Webster, a man who needs no introduction, which is why I have just introduced him. You can hear him more often on Roleplay Rescue or on his blog, also called Roleplay Rescue. And I've invited him to come chat with me because I'm, one, dying for conversation, and two, we wanted to talk about interacting. We want to talk more, I guess, about interacting with other gamers, about coaching and mentoring. And so, welcome back to Casting Shadows, Jay.
Thanks for having me on again. It's nice to be asked.
So, what prompted me to reach out again really was a blog post that you put out at time of recording, I think 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Or is when I saw it. I don't know when you wrote it.
Okay, I'm going to go and look it up.
And in which one of the members of your school club approached you asking about, actually dungeon mastering instead of whatever they felt that they were doing in that role. So
yeah, okay, yeah. Because I've also talked about this a little bit on the GM's Journal, which is the bonus episodes I do for my patrons.
right.
And probably more extensively spoken about it there actually. But yeah, essentially, so I run a school game club. Just for those who don't know. And so I'm a school teacher. On Tuesday night after school, we stay for about an hour and a half or so, and I get session time. And when we started this year, I decided that I would run a D&D game using BECMI, BECMI D&D for 1983, basic and expert specifically.
Yeah.
And that sort of led into a whole load of gaming for me, not just at the school club, but actually that game, which is set in a realm called Felmir, has become something I'm playing with on my Saturday night group as well on a bi-weekly basis. That's quite cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, this particular guy that you're talking about, who obviously has to remain nameless because I'm not allowed to talk about students and identify them, but essentially had been running since last year. When they first came to the school club, I was running stuff last year. I was very hands-off, and I just basically throwing products at them, and had been running some D&D with 5th edition. And it sort of, I think it started with the starter set, the original starter set, the good one, which actually has Fandelin and all that in it. Fandelver, isn't it?
The Mines of
Yeah,
Fandelver.
Fandelver, whatever it is. Yeah, that's the good starter set. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's probably what the Alexandrian says is the best ever module, like scenario for a box set ever. And had been mucking around and then had loads of, and essentially what I'd noticed last year was a lot of their sessions had just wordless like fights. They were running like extended fights and then some linking kind of bits of action and storytelling going on between, but basically big fights. And then at the start of this year, I'd started running this particular game, which is why this is relevant. And this other student had been like running a session alongside and then come to a ground to a halt and came over at the end of one particular session, I think the second one, and just kind of said, sir, like, how do you DM? To which my witty reply was, good question. Like, let me know when you figure it out. And then I led into a conversation which was along the lines of, look, what I'd advise you to do is to first of all go right back to your D&D roots. Like in what you were doing with, they had not actually used the Fandelver product. They just kind of like had that, and then he couldn't be bothered to read it, as far as I could tell. So he kind of like just ran the goblin fight and maybe the caves a bit, and then kind of like stopped and then gone off and done their own things with lots of different products. And what I realized is there's a massive lack of kind of like how to play. And now I had decided to use basic D&D simply because of that problem. Like, I knew that 5th edition games tend to be like too slow for a 1.5 hour session. It's very hard to run any kind of amount of adventure, especially if you have any combat scenes, in an hour and a half. If you're using 5th edition, it's a slower game system than basic D&D from 1983, simply because it's got a lot more rules.
Right.
And D&D basic for 1983 in a 1.5 hour session, I can run probably a half a dozen decent rooms, explorations, probably a couple of fights in there, 2-3 fights in there, no problem. Do you know what I mean? And I think what this happened is the students had observed that, and this particular student had certainly observed that sort of pace of play, and the fact that I'd been drawing, started with like 5 complete newbies, and then like gadflies drawing some of the other people in. They become interested in what we were doing because it was like looked exciting, and there was lots of laughter and noise and all of that. Like, how do you do that was kind of the question. So that's where we got to, and my answer to that was I had very naughtily, sorry wizards, but I had very naughtily printed off some copies of the basic and the basic player book and a basic dungeon master's book. So for those who don't know, the old red book had the rules broken into 2 pieces. There's a player's book
ring
which
holes.
has which has basically like a solo adventure, which is like just introduces the very concept of role playing, and then has a follow-on solo kind of turn the page kind of look up entry kind of style adventure, which is very famously with a character called Bargle at the end, a bad guy called Bargle. And then after that, you kind of get told how to roll up a character. And then if you want to be, and then if you're going to take on the game, it goes like, go to the DM book. And then there's this introduction to being a dungeon master and his first adventure. And what I love about the first adventure, it's set in a place called Castle Misdemeanor. And essentially you have like this castle, ruined castle. The surface and the first level of that are entirely keyed. And then there's a second level with a map, and you are encouraged to key the map. And then there's like this third level, and it says go draw a map and key it. And it takes you through like how to do that. It actually teaches you how to do D&D dungeon gaming. And I don't think since 1983, I don't think I've ever seen a product do that. Well, really, full stop. But certainly that's the best version that I've ever seen. So I'd printed off the player book and the GM's book. And what I've been doing is that a couple of players at the table who were curious to learn the rules, I had given them the player book and said, because they're in my GM, I'm GMing, that go read the player book, go play the solo stuff. And they've done that. And that's very successful, by the way, very successful, because then when there was a TPK, or no, not TPK, there was a half a party got killed a few weeks ago, and I was able to go to the players at the table. Here's a character sheet, here's a pencil, here's 3d6. You've got the book, go. And then like 20 minutes or whatever, they worked out how to put the characters together themselves because they had the rule book right at hand, and they played a little bit, so they knew what to do. So it's a great starting set. What happened with that GM is my advice to him was like, take this book and take that book. This book here tells you about GMing, being a dungeon master. Go play the player's book, start a bit at home, and then go and read the bit about being a DM. Okay. And then from there, what's happened is that he has stepped up and gone, can I sit with you while you're running? So we've got into a situation now where 2 sessions, he's been sat next to me, like while
behind
I'm
the
running,
screen.
and behind the screen, and I've been just walking him through what I'm doing, and
Cool.
and there's an element of what I'm doing that's using the rules, but there's an awful lot which is actually no, I'm not. This is about methods. It's like this is what I'm doing. It's how I'm approaching it and why. It's been quite fascinating, and I think he's enjoying that process. I'm hoping, because we went away we're on holiday as we record this. We're on holiday for a week. When we come back, he was talking about he's got excited, and he's talking about maybe wanting to run something again. So I'm wondering to see whether he'll come back for another sit by me watch, or whether he will take the plunge. But in the end, we'll see. But I think like that 83 old set like really stands up as a useful tool to give anybody. But what I realized had to sit alongside it is this willingness to let them in behind the screen. And I did sort of say
Sure.
up front, I said, if you ever want to sit at this table and play, you're in a problem. You're going to have a problem now because you know some stuff, that the other players don't know. But that's kind of the price of being a GM, that
Yeah.
that's part of the deal, isn't it?
You
Sorry,
can
I hope that
introduce
makes
them to
sense
the.
and wasn't too long.
No, it does. You can induct them into the sacred mystery of metagaming.
Yeah.
But no, that sounds fascinating, and the opportunity to have them behind the screen, to
Mm.
watch your drive, and that's pretty special, and not just for them to learn. I don't know about you, but I always find when I'm demonstrating something that it changes my thoughts about it.
Mm. Yeah, it also like helped me because I've been again, for people who don't listen to Roleplay Rescue, don't know that I've put myself back into a learning mode some weeks ago now. So this particular game is about 5 or 6 weeks we've been going since. So the school term is like 8 weeks, but we couldn't get started for the first 2, so it's been about 6 weeks. And I had it that in the run up to that over the summer, kind of run myself into a creative hole, and also was feeling very lacking in confidence, I guess is the way where I was. So I decided I'd just apprentice myself, and the term I used is an episode called like something around about being the apprentice. And
Yeah.
and my thinking here is to go right back to the beginning. So the reason I picked, that going back to like 1983 BetMe, and I knew that the school club, the kids would want to play D&D. It's a recognizable brand. I didn't want to run 5th edition. I was thought about it again. I actually have a copy of the starter set, the good one. And I was thinking about maybe I'd run that. But I knew that from past experience of running 5th edition that actually, like I said, that an hour and a half is not enough time for a lot of, if you get into a combat, it can take an hour to run a 5th
Sure.
edition fight of any size, especially if players are new and they are trying to figure out which of all their amazing abilities on their character sheet they want to use and how they work and all those kind of things. There's a lot of dither
Yeah.
factor that you have to take into account. Whereas with a Beckme character, you don't have any abilities. So,
Right.
it's like you're a fighter, you can hit things. You're a wizard, you got one spell. You're a cleric, you can turn undead. And if there's no undead, then you just hit things. And you're a thief, you just avoid hitting things, probably, because you've got 1d4 hit
Pretty
points.
much. Yeah.
But, maybe you stab people or shoot people or something. But that's about it, in a fight. So there's not even really, I mean, there are rules for movement and things, but it's not usually done like the battle board thing is not a big kind of encouraged part of that original game. And I'm not playing. I have in the very last session, I actually introduced using miniatures in a board because I realized the kids appreciated the visual element of that. I had to
Right.
invent some extra, like a little bit of granularity in the rules to make that work. But
Right.
it's essentially like it's not the same as the grid based 3rd, 4th, 5th edition D&D. So it actually, I'm being a bit unfair because 2.5 edition D&D also had that. So it's a very different kind of beast. It's very theatre of the mind, descriptive, quick moving. I mean, fights are over in 2 or 3 rounds, which is basic. If you've got a party of 5 characters, they all clobber and kill quite quickly, or
Right.
get clobbered and killed quite quickly. So it's very dynamic, I suppose, is the what I'm looking for, and that's what generates all the excitement, by the way, that and the risk of death, which is quite high.
Sure.
So it's exciting, and that's why I decided. But it also, for me, it was this like return to something that I was familiar with. That I as a player, I'd been a player in 1983. I was 12, and I'd been playing role playing for quite a few years, probably 4, 5, maybe even 6 years. Can't be exact about that. Probably as
Right.
much as 6 years. So because we certainly played 77 Traveller sometime around 77, 78, with some friends. So that's how I got into role playing. So when 83 came out, I got given that box set for Christmas, and I'd always intended to be a GM, but I never became the GM. But I read all the stuff, and that was like
Right.
my first taste of like going to be a dungeon master thing. And so I remembered it, and I thought, well, that worked for me. It surely could work at the table, to introduce new people
Yeah.
to the hobby. And lo and behold, it appears to be doing that. So I mean, by the way, there's more than one player is interested in GMing. One of the newbie players after 2 sessions was saying, "Hey, I'm going to write my own dungeon. When you finished running this one, can I run the game?" And took home a copy of those 2 books. And then there's another one of the girls is also like, "Oh, I'm really enjoying being a player, but might think about doing the dungeon master thing as well."
Right.
Because again, it's also accessible. And these are newbies. These are people who, 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, had never played a role playing game. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, totally. And that meshes with my experience from 83, which is when I started, is I played a session, I got handed the books, and you're going to run the next session. It's like, okay. And I did. And we were off to the races, and we met, we recruited more people and that kind of stuff. And everybody that we recruited had the game and they wanted to run it. And so everybody was a game master, everybody was a player. And that's still my default um, for normal, I think, which hasn't always been met, of course. We're living in abnormal times. But that kind of sink or swim mentoring was particularly good for me. But I found that when I've tried it with others, like, here's the book, go and do it, nothing has resulted from it. And it's like, I've got some ideas, but
yeah, I just think that, I mean, as an educator, it's this thing, and we both have that in common. I think we both probably understand and know why that happens as well. Like, so if I just say, like, here's a textbook, go learn about whatever subject, some people can do that. Most people won't do that. So there'll be this sense of, I don't know, we know where to start, and I've got to read all this, and if you're anything like me, I mean, my brain, I've got the kind of brain that wants to, I want the gratification of being able to do that now, instantly. And I don't, the idea of reading this whole book and like figuring it out was really, really difficult. I think one of the things that Mensa's D&D did really well was it sort of broke it into these little steps. So like I said,
right.
like as a GM, it's I learned to be a player by playing a couple of solo games, and then if I'm at home, it's just me and my mates, and we never played before. Now I get taken into this little other booklet which says, right, here's a starting point. So all your guys are going to get into roll up some characters, and then they're all going to go up to this castle, and you just follow this step by step through the first bit. And initially it's like there's a bit of a linear pathway,
Sure.
literal linear pathway into the castle. Once they get into there's a choice of sort of left or right, and then the map opens up a little bit, and there's kind of like some choice about where you move around, and there's some seriously meaningful decisions to be made inside of there that you sort of, when you run it, you learn that it's quite a nasty little level. Then there's some stairs down, and then as the GM you get like there's a map to what's down there, and what I love is a little list of like, here's some things that are probably down there, some of the creatures,
right,
key them, put them out there, and some treasures. Here's some things that are probably down there. By the way, tables at the back of the book, go use them, and then off you go. And then, of course, when you get down there, there's a couple of sets, or at least one set of stairs, I think, maybe even 2 from memory, that go down to a 3rd level there's no map for, and the book just says, go draw a map. You've got 2 examples here. Now, that step-by-step process worked for me, enough anyway. And I actually returned to Mensa's book in 2016. So when I returned to... I'd come out of 5th edition, and I was like into the OSR community, and then I was very disillusioned with 5th edition. I went right back to the beginning, and I opened up my 83 box set, and I actually ran a couple of sessions with D&D, and then I decided that we decided we didn't really fancy playing that basic D&D rule set, and at the time I was inured with Mithras, so I actually ended up running that dungeon with Mithras's classic fantasy stuff in 2016, and I wrote a lot about it back on the old blog then, and that just like opened up the hobby again to me for after becoming so disillusioned with 5th edition D&D. So It's kind of interesting. And I right now, as I sit at the sort of with those kids at the table, I realize that there's a methodological difference between like how I really want to play, which is this kind of older style and
Right.
approach, which doesn't mesh very well with where the official Dungeons and Dragons has kind of gone, if you know what I mean, in terms of like
Right.
the emphasis on linear storytelling and story up front versus this older thing of like lots of
Experience.
play. Well, it's really about giving players a lot of agency. It's about exploring. Like they talk about the three in fifth edition. Talks about the three pillars of role playing, and exploration is one of them. You know,
Right.
and role playing and fighting being the other two, but actually doesn't in anywhere in sort of fifth edition tell you how to run an exploration game. And in fact, there's not even as much as a keyed map in the DMG.
Right.
There's maps, but they're not keyed, and there's no example of a keyed map anywhere to show you how to do a dungeon kind of based game. You know, and
Right.
it's only really on hindsight looking back that I realized that that's missing. Why is that missing from a hobby? Because actually many people in a hobby have gone off in a different methodological direction. Not a bad thing, by the way, but just
Just
a
different.
different
Yeah.
methodological which I don't enjoy. I actually love the exploration of the world, and I think we talked before about exploration of character as well.
Right.
And so coming back to this kind of approach, you know, first of all, is really exciting as a player and a GM, but also like I found I can teach it because those tools were created in all these years ago, 40 years ago,
Right.
and I can use those tools and teach it. Whereas I actually have no clue how to teach people to do linear story based. I don't know what you want to call it, but that approach, you know, that
Right.
whole epic you know, adventure kind of thing. I don't know how to run that, so I can't teach it, you know.
Yeah.
And
I
so I
can hear
realized that,
you.
and I think, and having that realization and then going to the table with that old game, and then it's just unlocked so much fun for everybody. To me, it was like, well, this is working. You know, it's not like it's morally right or wrong or good or bad or better or worse. It's just this is working, and we're having fun. So
It's working.
let's keep
Fun
doing
is
that.
contagious.
Yeah.
You're probably more comfortable and more
Mm.
confident because everything
Yeah.
makes sense, and all of that is communicated non-verbally to the people that you're with.
Mm. And it's
Yeah.
worth saying that there is another group of players at the club who came along last year and got into fifth edition and are playing in a more modern style, I suppose, in that they're playing in that sort of they have a GM who's got a bit of a plot that they're running each other through
Right.
and using the fifth edition mechanics loosely because they actually don't really use the rules as much. They're playing a much more sort of storytelling. um I would, I don't know how to describe it. The best phrase I've heard is a sort of "Mother May I" kind of thing. Like I'm doing this kind of like,
Can I do this? Yeah,
can I
you
do
hear that a
this?
lot. Yeah.
Um,
Sure. Give me a. Yeah.
yeah, and they're having a lot of fun with that, and they're doing their thing, and that's all cool. Like there's space for that where we're running. It's just that when I was introducing new people, I had to find a way of saying this is what D&D is, kind of, or what it can be. And I'm
Right.
always open about the fact that there's lots of different approaches. This is just one of them. But yeah, to come back to the subject of like how you mentor a new player, I think you have to know what you're doing well enough to be able to show them how to do it. And then you probably need to give them some tools. And those tools can't just be, here's the rule book. It kind of has
Most
to
of the time,
be,
yeah.
yeah, unless that book, and these aren't these rule books because it's actually booklets and they're actually
Yeah.
broken down into sections and they're like it's a
With kids
tool
in
set.
mind, I think.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, a lot of people don't. I think a lot of people don't play Beckney because they see it as kiddie D&D. You know, they'd much
But
rather play
it
BX, which is nigh on the same system. You know, I know
yeah,
there are lots of little differences, but nigh
lots.
on the same thing,
Yeah.
but actually just presented as a, you know, as a smaller, thinner, lighter rulebook.
Right.
It does a fair job of teaching you. Like it has some guidance on how to do a dungeon, how to do and later on with the expert set, how to set up a sort of wilderness game. But it doesn't do it in as much as a broken down kind of structure as the
Right.
later book.
And that's what I started with. And I uh, I really appreciated Beckme at the time, and so I never ended up buying or getting expert, the
Mm.
BX expert.
Hmm.
There were copies in the group that
Yeah.
I read, but I didn't feel compelled to go get it. But I
Mm.
did get used copies and pick up discarded copies of Beckme.
Yeah.
So it
Well,
impressed me, I think.
I had the weird thing of not really ever really getting into. I had expert, but weirdly I had. By the way, I had the red box 83 basic. I actually had picked up the 1981 expert book because until recently I didn't have the Beckme expert
Right,
book, and I picked a copy of that up. Um, I then read that like recently. So in the last sort of 2 months, I have read those rule books, and because I never became a D&D GM back in 1983, in the end, I never did. I was always a player. There were other guys who wanted to run games, and we rapidly moved on away from D&D anyway. So I never
right.
got to really use it. It wasn't until 2016 that I actually sat down with it and used it and realized, oh, it's actually kind of a clever product. And then
Right.
obviously in 2023 to go, it's a clever product. Why don't I use it? You
Yeah.
know, so that's where I'm at anyway.
Yeah. I think it's an important part of this particular conversation about coaching and whatnot. The presence or absence of guiding text,
Hmm.
so that it's not just like with a physical skill. At some point in a lesson, you're going to send somebody away to practice,
Yeah.
right? Go do 1,000 cuts or go
Mm-hmm.
do 500 punches or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And when it's a mental activity, there does need to be some time for reflection,
Yeah.
but there does need to be an alternate input, like read the exact same material, but in someone else's voice, not just my voice. And then we'll come together and do the thing and see what makes sense to synthesize all of those elements.
I also found like having this student at the table. So over 2 sessions. The first session was really interesting where they were largely watching and I was sort of explaining. They might ask a couple of questions. But so like for example, we were in a dungeon. I think the first session that they were observing, we were at the tail end of in a dungeon, and the players had decided to try and extricate themselves from that dungeon. And what was witnessed was so this is where they are on the map. I'll show you the map. This is where they are on the map. And by the way, here's my key, which is my hand scribbled notes, because
Right.
I'd used a map from another product. I don't want to name it because other
Right.
co-adventurers might go into it. But I had hand then keyed. I've got a little notebook and I'd hand keyed some of the dungeon. So the first thing I was saying to the guy was, I haven't done the whole dungeon. I thought they would most likely to go into this area on the map up here, and that's been quite detailed. This bit they were actually went into when they came here last session. I didn't have any idea or much of an idea what was there. So essentially, I improvised these things, and then in between that session and this one in the week, I have like filled out a few of these locations with some things. And what I was able to show them was that there was like the tunnels with sarcophagi. I had for each of the sarcophagi, I had, instead of like detailing what was in it, I put together a little short D6 table. And
Oh,
what we were doing is when they went to open the sarcophagus, I would roll on the table to find out what was inside. Um, and so showed them the use of a random roll. I also
yeah.
was using the core mechanisms of the game, has this random wandering monster encounter roll, I think is the correct term.
Right.
And so we were rolling, and I had them roll the dice. So I said, okay, you roll the d6. If it comes up a 1 or a 2 in this part of the dungeon, then let me know, and we'll generate some. And that's what happened. He rolled first time, nothing. Second time, got a 1. Right, now we've got to generate a wandering monster encounter. So I flipped to the back of the rule book, rolled d20 on that table.
Yes.
And actually what came out was this bizarre, I think it was troglodytes or something. And I kind of went, look, that creature is not going to fit in this idea. So I then went, I'm not going to use it. I just went, I'm going to use the skeletons off the list there. That's actually like looking on the list. I'm just going to do that. And I said, now some GMs will like freak out and be screaming at me at this point that I'm like, I made a die roll, and then I kind of like chose it.
I
But
ignored it.
but I ignore that die roll. But what I said to them is like, I'm with troglodytes in a tomb that's just been basically there's a secret room. They just opened up this bit of a tomb that had been like thousands. The idea is it's supposed to be thousands of years sealed. No one's ever been in there. It's a secret room, and I had already established that there were some vermin in there because we'd had an earlier encounter with rats, giant rats, but I didn't want anything kind of sentient and alive down there. And
Right.
I don't even know why I went with the roll. I think it was just to demonstrate to the person that you can make it. You would make a die roll when you get a wandering monster encounter. You don't have to make a decision. But then I said I'm not happy with that because I don't think troglodytes would live in this thing simply because where would they come from? Where would they get their food? So I'm going to nix that and go. It's going to be skeletons. That makes loads of sense. I didn't tell them what else went through my mind, which is that zombies are too hard. Mummies are a bad idea. Wraith would be a bad idea. I know all of that they're way too tough. Yeah,
Right.
skeletons is just fine for level 1 characters, isn't it? And then just rolled them, showed them like number encountered. I think it was 1 to 6 or something. So it's like rolled that dice. That's how many we got, and then started to set that encounter up. Like rolled the encounter distance. There's no reaction roll because they're undead. But all of those things were explained really, really quickly behind the screen. And I think then I think that shows a person is an entire methodology of how to run like this location-based dungeon adventure. You've essentially got the core things going on there, and demonstrating that was really good. Where we got to in the second session was I was able to say to them, right, so you're tracking all my wandering monsters for me, and actually when it comes to the fight as well, like the reaction's down to you. So you can roll on the reaction roll table or you can decide. Okay. So then the second session comes along and the players, they went to town, they did some shopping, and then they decided they wanted to go hunting in the wild. And I'm kind of like, oh dear, never mind. Because, what do you do? So I sort of said to the guy, I've got nothing prepped. So what should we do? And he went, why don't we roll on the wandering monster table? Let's see what happens, because they're going hunting for something. So let's see what's on the table. So we rolled and we got kobolds. And then I said, go look up kobolds and tell me if you want to run with those. So he looked up kobolds and went, yeah, they look cool. So we rolled a random number of kobolds, because obviously the players are still discussing. So you can do a little bit of back and forth. And we got 9 kobolds. And it was near the end of the session. So we got them into a situation where they were tracking these creatures. And then the creatures were in a little campy thing. And then it was like they got up in a tree and they decided they'd try and ambush them, which, we did the surprise rolls and they managed to surprise the kobolds that actually we were describing as dog-headed humanoids with claws, like, all the description stuff, not calling them kobolds. So I'm demonstrating all of that stuff. And then we got to the end of the first round. They killed one of them with some missile fire. And I said, right, session over. We'll pick up next time. We're right in the middle of a combat, which is, by the way, again, another thing that a lot of GMs would be screaming, no, don't ever stop. But I'm going cliffhanger. I said to the kid, cliffhanger. They want to know what happens next time. They're going to want to resolve this. Also, it buys me time as GM, or us time as GM, to co-DM, to actually decide what the heck's going on, because we have nothing planned. And he went, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. So I then said, so you go and think about it, I'll go and think about it. When we come back next time, obviously I'm going to decide what this is really about, but I'm interested in knowing what you think.
Right.
And when we got back, he was like, do these kobolds have some kind of leader? And I went, that's a really good question. Maybe they do. Hey, let's have some fun. Let's make it a shaman, and let's give him some clerical magic, and let's make him higher level just for fun. So we did. And we had the kobold cleric shaman, like, whiz off a couple of spells, which spiced the entire thing up. And, it led to this really nasty combat where 2 of the player characters out of 5 died.
Wow.
In exciting ways. But actually, what happened is the party decided to sue for peace, and then they decided they would challenge the cleric of the player party, challenged the shaman of the kobolds to a duel, and then the shaman of the kobolds and the cleric decided both have champions. So one of the fighters, the hardest fighter, she stepped up to do the combat, and then we beefed up. We looked at our kobold hit point list and we picked the one with the most hit points, like 7 or whatever it was, something like that, or 5. Anyway, really no number of hit points anyway. But had them step up and we described them as a little bit more beefy and had a bigger sword or whatever. And then that, the player character proceeded to cut down this poor kobold in one-on-one combat, which was going to happen.
Right.
And that resolved it. And then the rest of the monster party disengaged. They sued for peace and left it alone. And then these two remaining characters kind of went back to the town, and now they're recruiting new players. And this was the point where I was able to go to the three guys who'd lost their characters to go, there you go, roll up characters. Now the whole kind of learning there, what was really interesting was that the co-GM was going, wow, like you can do all sorts of stuff. Like you can decide one of the monsters is a boss. You can even give them like special powers and give them class abilities. Yeah, you can do that if you want. I wouldn't recommend it a lot, but you can. Also, like the whole parley and the whole kind of like thing about running like a duel and all of that, I would never have thought of that. And I was like, no, I hadn't thought about that, but it kind of came up. One of the players decided to go, what happens if I kind of like offer to surrender, and off we went into, all right, we'll roll with that, and I think there was a whole load of very rich learning, both for me and for that co-GM, and obviously for the players in that whole interaction that makes this game way more interesting, and now they've got this situation where they decided, because they couldn't take the bodies back, and they decided they want to go and recover the bodies. So I think next session is going to be going to recover the bodies and try and bring back the treasure that they had, the armor and the gear they couldn't carry, all of that stuff. Get a wagon, kind of go, or some kind of cart or something to bring back the bodies and bury them properly, because that's really important. All of that arises from like taking the world and the characters seriously has kind of already started to happen. The players were, generating all of that. That's what we want to do next time. So we want to bring back the bodies. That stuff hadn't happened in my gaming for a very long time. So as part of
Real
this
stuff.
is the nature of part of this is the nature of old D&D, but a big part of it is the free-form open creativity that comes from rolling a wonder monster and just seeing what happens, and what I also realized is the big part of this as well is the level of player agency kind of rocketed. There are two things. When characters died, there was a sense of like, oh, this is real, like it matters what we do. It really does matter. Someone actually said, like, we're not going to respawn here, are we? It's like, no. And it's like, oh crap. I've got to roll the character. And then so now they're a lot more cautious. But I think the second thing with that was the sense of, but when we decided to, I think somebody said something along the lines of, when we decided to go hunting, like that actually meant something. Like we thought we were mucking about and, that, we'll go hunting for something and see what we can find out there. And I mean, to be honest with you, off that list, they could have had some really horrendous creatures. Troglodytes would have been nasty. But they didn't realize. Now they do. And I think, so there's a player experience, but I think from that co-GM perspective, that whole thing of it doesn't, like I just taught him it doesn't matter if you kill half the party. That's still fun. I just taught him that you can monkey around with the encounter, that you could decide or you can roll. I did roll for the reaction of the creatures.
And then decided.
And then the player actions made it a combat because they decided to ambush. That was their call. The creatures were like unaware, but would have been neutral. So it would have been a case of like, they would have been a bit, wanting to find out what the intentions of the players were. We did all of that in that half an hour, because that whole encounter was about, that first bit was probably about 15 minutes towards the end of the session. I said I called it, and then into the next session, probably 10 or 15 minutes of playtime. So in about half an hour of actual game time, so much rich teaching happened. From someone sitting next to you and just talking it through. And then I think if he's back at the table with me next time, like when they decide to go and recover the bodies or whatever, I'm going to go. So what's out there? I might have some ideas in my back pocket, but I'm probably going to say to this guy, what's out there? What will they find? Will the bodies still be there? I mean, in my mind, maybe the wolves have half eaten them, or maybe the kobolds came back and looted all the bodies after they left because they left the bodies out there for a few hours, So I don't know, but I'm going to see what I would naturally say. Well, what do you think? And then perhaps roll with those ideas. I guess in some sense, it's almost like you cede more and more of your GM seat to allow them to take a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
more of it.
yeah,
Anyway, that's what I've
absolutely.
been doing. So I don't know if there's questions from that, or if I don't know if that's actually any use. But I've witted for a long while.
I don't think there was any wittering. Yeah, I mean that is, I mean, how I conceive of like an ideal test bed for like launching someone confidently into role playing without constantly second guessing or whatever. You know, they're with support material that is has been written to teach them step by step what to do, is a very small page count. So even if they can't remember where it is, they can find it even under stress, probably.
Yeah.
And they have seen the thought process that the text, because of its narrow page count, struggles to be able to communicate, which is the actual experience of game mastery.
Mm.
So, that's
It
quite a
was a
gift.
couple of responses to that is actually interesting. Like I kept losing my page because I'm very bad at like bookmarks and things. So I was, literally had the old book in front of me, and I kept losing the Cobalt page because we would go flip to the back to find the treasure, or flip to back to roll on a table, or flipping to the page on combat to find the combat procedure because I was trying to walk him through. Right,
Right.
they declare actions, then there's movement, then there's missile fire, spells, melee,
Right.
whatever. We'd had the group initiative roles going on. We had a simultaneous combat going on. So I was flipping like a little bit to go looking at modifiers and other things for that, like showing him where that is in the book, and kept losing my Cobalt page. But it didn't matter because that little book is like,
Yeah.
you can just find the things really, really quickly. I was list off, even saying to a person like that the monsters are alphabetical. So all you got to do is follow your alphabet. Um, Little things like that, I think, are actually huge.
Huge. Yeah.
When you're under pressure at the table and the players are like, you know,
Looking at you, waiting.
looking at you. Yeah, I mean, although what the only other things that was really interesting to note is how much with 5 or 6 young players, how much they're just chattering and wittering. So if you're trying to sort something out, they'll be in character having conversation, or they'll be talking about what they're going to do next, or hey, why don't you try and sneak around the side and ambush them from there, and all that stuff's going on. And
Right.
I think I pointed out, I sort of said, like, you can, if they're talking and having a good time, just shut up and let them do it. There's a bit when we went shopping where they got into an argument. The players got into an argument about what to buy from a blacksmith, and they had like someone wanted a shield and some plate armor. Wanted they wanted to have more sets of armor amongst the fighters and the cleric, and they were trying to work out like with the gold they had like the best deal, and then like also what they were going to sell of the treasure they had to try and and all that. And there was a bit where they got into an argument. 2 of the players got into a bit of an argument, and I'm just sitting there totally silent. And he whispers to me, he goes, "Why aren't you stopping them arguing?" I said, "Because they're having fun." Because if you watch that argument, it's not like the at each other throat argument. They were smiling and laughing and actually in character having a discussion
Right.
about, yeah, I hear what you say about plate armor, but surely it would be better to buy 2 sets of chainmail armor and
Right.
and
Surely
that
it
was
would
what
be
was going
better.
on. Yeah, and I just said like butt out. I said to him like, you just butt out if they're having fun. And it comes to a point where you're probably going to step in if it's going on too long, but or at least remind them of what's going on. I sort of said to him, the best thing to do is to, at some point when you get a little bit, it's going on a while, is just to roll for a random encounter or something. If we're in a dungeon,
Yeah.
it's like,
Clatter.
or roll some dice, and that always gets their attention. And he went,
Yeah.
"What, really?" And I went, "Yeah, watch." So we did it. I picked up like percentile dice and rolled them, and my ones are quite big, so it was like, and that sound, and I was like, what was that? I was like, oh, nothing, just rolling something. you know, and you know as well as I do, there's a certain element of paranoia that players have. So it was
Right.
kind of fun, and all these little techniques that I think are part of
Right.
what it means to be a good GM.
The
But
culture of play. Yes.
Yeah, like I said, methodology, to be a bit more technical. There's the rules and there's your world, but there's also linking those two things is kind of like a method of play, and that's what I am teaching is as an older school
Procedures.
method of play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all of that is, taken as an aggregate, is all steeped in an outlook of, like, what are we playing for, like,
Mm.
and the thoughts about violence, the thoughts about alignment, the thoughts about what makes good tactics or good strategy, and what do we do with the loot, or do we care, and do we have to cart
Mm.
stuff back home from the dungeon? Is that going to be a part of play or not? All of these
Mm-hmm.
things turn into a recognizable set of expectations or culture of
Yeah,
play. But
and based in what Mensa wrote in '83. So there are only a couple of deviations from the methodology that's taught. So like the question of like, do they have to lug the treasure back? Yes, but they get their according to the rulebook, you get the experience at the end of session. So they got experience at the end of session, even if they hadn't taken the treasure back to town. Now, in the past, I might have been tempted to wait until they get back to town with the treasure to give them the
right,
XP. But then I realized, reflecting on it, if they die in the dungeon, it doesn't matter if they got the XP anyway, right?
yes,
And if they don't die in the dungeon, they're going to bring in the treasure back. So even if they have found something and then later in another session discard it because they want to find something that's even more valuable, I'm not really that bothered about the 50
right,
XP that represents. So I don't care enough about that. So I went, let's go with the rules as written, right? And this is the other thing to say is that there's a massive liberation. So me as a very experienced GM who's lost all their confidence, I found just letting go of that, like to go with the methodology as prescribed in the rule book, which because it's rules and it's also got this methodological stream through it, just to use that without like uncritically was actually
right.
very, 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 very relieving. And now I'm at a point where 8 sessions on in total, across 2 groups, I am at the point of starting to deviate. So I've decided that my Saturday night group, we're not going to use Bet Me. We're going to use a slightly different BX based game, but we're not using that set of rules because we just want to go a little bit deeper. Whereas at the school
Right.
club, we'll carry on with basic unique because that's just fine right now,
Right.
And my world can survive that, you know, that
Yeah.
the way the world works between 2 groups can survive on 2 similar and related rule sets, not a problem. The core
Yeah.
methodology is the same, really, and little tweaks. So and again, to introduce a new GM to, it's up to you if you, because again, Mensa's rulebook says about a few things, like it's up to you. So a good example is with, if they do something and there's no rule for it, how do you resolve it? One option is to roll against their attributes. And in the
Yeah.
BECME, it actually says you could roll 1d20 under, you could roll 3d6 under, or you could roll any other combination of dice that you like under their stat to find out like how they do.
Right.
And I liked that when I came across that paragraph, I was like, it doesn't even tell me. I mean, the tradition by the time you got to 1991 with Cyclopedia is that it's in the rulebook and it's 1d20 under. But I don't like 1d20 under for sort of inverted commas skill checks. So I
Right.
went with 3d6. And I said to him, although the text here gives those options, I'm going with the 3d6 one. And the reason is because I know that makes higher values and middle values more likely to succeed more of the time because of the bell curve. And it very
Right.
briefly explained to a 12-year-old kid, like
The bell
the
curve.
maths of a bell curve, which, as a 12-year-old high school kid, he knows enough about maths and probably better at maths than me. So he was able to go, oh yeah, I get that. We are talking about intellectually precocious people here. So,
Right.
that they're not, they're not, don't usually struggle with those kind of concepts at all. So, that worked well. And I said, like, but if you run your game, feel free. Like, if you ran it with 5th edition, you'd be running 1d20 roll high with the bonus off your stat. And that's how that rule works. Just go with the rule. And that's absolutely fine. And
Yeah.
that's the last thing I want to say actually on this as well is that all the time I've been saying, like, so when you do this with 5th edition, the rules are slightly different. Right? Or you just think this is the method, and all you do is apply your rule as it's written down in the rule book, which means you need to go and read the rule book, And there's this funny moment where he went, but that big 5th edition rule book is way bigger than this little thing. I'm like, yeah, that's why I like this little thing. But that's just me, you know.
He can discover for himself that there's the rules, which is like this many pages, a handful of pages, and then there's all the all the details.
Yeah,
But,
all of the feats,
yes.
spells, other powers, abilities, and other things, which are all fun. Don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
I'm not an anti 5th edition. It's just it's not my jam.
Yeah. Well, we got this expression that I came up with in martial arts, which was tools for targets. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so that what is the experience I'm looking for, and what is the tool that I should be using for that. It doesn't make the other tools that you're not using in that moment bad ones. It's just,
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone who listens to Roleplay Rescue knows that my favorite game system is actually GURPS.
right.
So, but why am I not running GURPS at the school club? Well, partly because it's a school D&D club and the kids recognize D&D, and I want to make sure that they can have that connection to that product. I've been open about the fact that this is an older version of D&D, and the reason for it is because it's just, quote, what I said was, it's just simpler and faster. It's like there's less rules, and so it's a little bit simpler and faster to run. And we've only got an hour and a half. There's nothing wrong with the other game. Go enjoy it. And if you want a starter set, there's one in the cupboard over there. You can go and have. No problem. No one's taken it yet, but it's there. And then, like, why am I not running GURPS? Well, I could run a GURPS game with them, and there's nothing stopping me. And even I have essentially developed what I call simple dungeon GURPS, which uses a lot of random stuff and bits and bobs to get us going and quickly, and that would be fine. Except that that's not the goal of the club. The goal of the club is not to run like a deep, rich, like narratively, challenging, I suppose, in terms of like, detailed and challenging and in character experience. It's not what I'm trying to do. Why am I not running, as I spoke to you before in your earlier podcast when we did together, why am I not running this with Otherworld immersed game with all the rules behind the screen? Why am I not doing that? Because I'm trying to teach them the core, most common, regular kind of D&D game. Actually, I'm effectively teaching them an OSR style of that, if we use modern parlance. And
You've got to
some
start
might say
somewhere.
but some might say that's not the regular kind of game, because most people play D&D and they don't play in that style, But still, it's a recognizable like approach and form of game where the players are aware of the rules. They have their character sheet in front of them, such as it is, and they are interacting with the game mechanisms as much as they're interacting with your world, right? So I wanted to provide that experience. I absolutely decided that this is the agenda. This is what we're doing at this game group. If the kids were to say to me like, "Sir, can we play like a game like the way you would want to play it?" That's a whole different.
Right.
And the first thing I'd be saying is, well, we can't in an hour and a half, because I can't.
Right.
I need at least 2.5, maybe 3 hour session to make that meaningful. I've struggled with my personal game previously with a 2 hour session at night online. I really struggled to do anything as rich as I wanted to. So that's why I stopped trying to do that, because I don't have the slot of time. So you go with something different, because well, I found from experience that trying to beat my head against the wall of trying to fit something in to the time you don't have, it just doesn't work.
Yeah,
And
it doesn't
trying to
work.
run
It just builds frustration.
and I much prefer the rich, deep GURPS, characterized, statted, detailed game. Actually, much prefer it. But it's not as, it is playable, don't get me wrong, but it's not as easily accessible. And I needed really super easy access, and roll 3d6 in order and write that on your sheet is extremely accessible. Even if, again, it's not my preference. I honestly, if you roll a 3 for strength, tough, one player actually did rolls under 6 for every stat. And the book says you might allow them to re-roll some of those, So that's what we did. We followed the book. When it was like there was, I think it's when there's 3 or more stats less than 8, I think it says, and maybe re-roll them. So we did. We re-rolled them all. It still didn't come out very well, but equally there are players. I think that fighter I talked about, that she plays a character called Freya. she's got like 18 strength, I think.
Right.
So roll that. The odds of that are what was it, 1.2 or less percent chance, or
It's
0.2,
it's
0.2%, something like that. It's
pretty
ridiculously
small.
unlikely. But
Yeah.
they rolled it. Hooray! We all celebrated and got +3 on the strength and an attack roll. So
Yeah.
strength gives you attack roll and damage, right? So she's got a two-handed sword, 1d10 +3 damage.
A monster.
She will kill a kobold. I think they have 1 to 4 hit points, don't they? So she will kill a kobold. So anyway, I wit her.
So that's pretty slick. So I think that's a better example than I ever would have hoped for how mentoring can work or how coaching can work uh, in this context. When we talked the last time, when we talked about the club and the kids discovering the games and what they were doing with them, it kind of sent me back on a journey of how did we, without that, without a school club, without a present guiding force, we had random advice from older brothers, and we had, how did we teach ourselves how to play? And the context was that most of us were not allowed to play. It's the middle of the satanic panic. It was a big deal, small town. We weren't allowed to play. So it was all secretive, right? We're playing, walking to school. We're playing, standing in stairwells. Our character sheets are on card notes that we can hide in pockets. It's like, it's ridiculous. I didn't even own dice until I've been playing for 3-4 years,
Right.
And so like one set of dice, and we're all sharing them, and roll them on your binder. So how did we ever learn? We read and reread and reread either Holmes or Menser or Moldvay, right? Whichever pieces we had of stuff, and we read through whatever modules people had and that sort of stuff. But mostly we talked.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It was discussion, and it was playing and then talking over it after. So I remember we'd never really challenged a GM's decision in the middle of a game. I don't really ever remember that happening through all of my games with Traveller, and then we got into D&D, and then we got into Rollmaster, and so on and so on and so on. And Star Frontiers was a game we played a lot of as well back in the 80s. So it's at least 4 different game systems. One of those, Rollmaster, was extremely complex. But I remember, they're in comparison. I remember that we would play the session, and at the end of the session, so the most famous session of Rollmaster was later on, about 86, 87. We did a 24-hour charity roleplay thing, and Goriel Swift, my halfling, got in the Moria, got into a fight. The party got into a fight with the Balrog of Moria, and Goriel decapitated the Balrog. Right? That's what happened. So the GM narrated he leaps 60 feet into the air and swings his short sword and takes off the thing's head. So that's what happened, and that's what I'll always remember. And it's my favorite character of all time because of that moment. But at the end of the session, I remember us having a conversation together with that wouldn't have happened. We did that wrong. You know what I mean? Like, we went back to the rule books and we picked it apart and we went, okay, it's what we should have done. And that's how we learned. Part of it is how we learned the rules. But there were times where the conversations were, actually, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I learned, for example, to kibosh a random table roll from a discussion with the GM where we'd been in a kind of similar situation to one I described earlier, where we're in a dungeon and he got something on the random table and he put it into the dungeon, and we were all like, as players, all going, where the hell did they come from? Like, how this is there must be another we were like, there must be another entrance.
There must be another entrance, yeah.
Because how did they get in here? Like, what would they eat? What would they survive on? That was the discussion that was had amongst the player characters. And at the end of the session, the GM was kind of like, yeah, it was off a random table. And we had a conversation about whether maybe we should sometimes modify what we've rolled. Maybe if it doesn't make sense in the world, then maybe you should change that. Although the argument went both ways, because he was saying, yeah, but actually the ideas you came up with about there being another exit, I thought about maybe just having this tunnel come off and going to a cave somewhere where these creatures might actually come from. I could do that, So we're talking about, I guess it's the abduction thing, isn't it? Where you work with this. If these facts are true, then
Right.
if these other facts must be true, kind of
Yeah.
thing. That's what we do all the time. That thought process. But essentially, what it came down to was like, yeah, I probably should have changed the role, and I can
Right.
remember having conversations like that. And that's, I think, how
Definitely.
we learned. Like, as players,
Definitely.
the GM would occasionally open up and say, "Hey, what do you think about this thing? I did that. We
Was it
did this,
fun?
but
Was it
yeah,
frustrating? Yeah.
yeah, and because we were all friends and we were all learning, that was fine.
Yeah.
So we actually literally coached each other, because the difference
Yes.
between mentoring and coaching. So mentor is one who will show you, tell you, and there was often like this process of talking through like theoretically what you do, and then showing like the person might observe you doing the thing.
Yeah.
Coaching tends to be a lot more along the lines of like you're doing something and you have the coach comes along and says, "How are you doing with the thing?" And then what problems have you and the person is themselves producing the answers.
Right.
Like there's a different process and dynamic. Well, so I think like that was back in the day. There was probably a lot more coached learning going on, even
Right.
though we
On,
wouldn't
on a
have
peer to
known
peer level
yeah,
also. Yeah.
and we wouldn't have thought about it in those formal terms, but we just
No.
that was what we were doing. There was an element, and sometimes you were just listening to conversation. I didn't often chip into these conversations very much. I just remember listening to them, and the other guys who had more. Like there were at least 4 guys around the table who GM'd.
Right.
I didn't, so it was a case of like I would listen in on what they would say, and I learned. It seems a lot from that. Even though I never really took the plunge back in those days. It was only when I was forced to be GM, because there were no GMs, that I've become, as I am now, pretty much. I love the GMing bit, even though I have a
Yeah.
love-hate relationship with it, but I broadly love it. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, how did we learn from each other? By a process of trial and error.
Trial and error, deduction, abduction.
Mm-hmm.
But what I remember most is that we were all running games and not necessarily with each other in them, right? Because it was
Mm-hmm.
very much
Okay.
play as you can. So I had multiple worlds, and we all had multiple characters, and that kind of thing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there is a lot of what happened in your game
Mm-hmm.
conversations, and I couldn't find the rule for this. What would you have done? Conversations, and you could have done this, or what about this monster, or what about this situation, and remember what that guy did in his game. Well, you could, an
Yeah.
awful lot of broadening of your knowledge base, or refreshing your memory of things that you could or should do or not do, and why was so and so upset at the end of the game, and why was this one fun but the other one not fun. Lots of
Yeah.
conversations like that.
And there were conversations around, I've been reading this other game and there's this idea, and that's what happened with the Red Box with our group, because we'd been playing for years. But when the Red Box came along, when I got that for Christmas and I was reading it, I remember taking some of that stuff to the group and going, I'm not saying we should run this, but there's loads of, information in here that, about dungeons and things that we didn't really have access to. So it was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then we started picking it apart, So
Right.
I think like I learned to key a map because the modules that we got from both from Game Design Workshop, but also from TSR, showed you a map with the numbers on it, and then there was linked text, But I think I learned to make the key tighter when I read Mentz's Redbox, because it was the way that was
Very
laid out was
specific.
was
Yeah.
about teaching, and it was very specific, Um, and I still think there are flaws in it, when I look at it now, but it's still like the best tool I've seen. The only thing that comes anywhere close to it is Justin Alexander's co-wrote a game recently called Magical Kitties Save the World.
Right.
And he's directly said that he was inspired by the Mensa Red Box when he did this, but he's done it's a game aimed at 8-year-olds or something like that. It's like 8 to 12-year-olds. Magical Kitty Save the World kind of tells you it's like something. It is actually a cracking little fun game, but
Right.
it has a starting adventure, which is it's done as a cartoon, like a graphic novel style.
Oh, cool.
But it's that turn to the page that thing. But it's a
Right.
very well done, and they're definitely inspired by Mensa. And then the parts of the rules where it says about like there's adventures to run in that box, and then when it says about doing your own things, again, it's got guidance. It's got like some structured guidance in there, and that is the closest I have seen to a how to do GMing in a modern product. In a very, very long one. I think it's a very good one.
Yeah.
But
Now you
not
had
many
brought
people are
up.
going to pick up that box set.
I don't know how many people are going to want to. How many old people are going to want to play Magical Kitties, but it's probably more than I
Yeah,
think.
I'd love to have a go. But I bought it because I thought my wife might get her back to the table with that one, and she's
Right.
tempted by the Magical Kitties, but still too burned by appalling group dynamics. So
Uh,
never mind.
uh, well, to close up, I guess you had brought up Mithras.
Yep.
You had brought up Mithras, which is a game very close to my heart, and I think it kind of rounds out this conversation in that Menser, I feel very lovingly and patiently walks you through step by step. You know nothing to
Mm-hmm.
now go make a map and play
Mm-hmm.
with your friends. And I find for the older gamer or for the returning gamer, that's something that Mithras does too,
Mm-hmm.
but with the intermediate and advanced kind of material, so to speak.
Mm.
Like it, as you go through Mithras, it's explaining to you this is why we're using the statistics this way,
Yeah.
right? This is why the derived stats are this way. This is how you build a cult. This is how a cult would operate. You're not going to call it a cult. You're going to give it a different name, and it's going to have a different position in your society. But it patiently talks to you all the way through every rule about what you can, what you can do with it and
Yeah.
why it's written the way it is. And I found it really refreshing to have the game kind of speaking to me directly in that way. And there aren't very many of those either. Right? There's a
No, I mean, some years ago I wrote a blog post, and I've put it onto Roleplay Rescue. You can look it up, an apologia for Mythos Classic Fantasy, and the reason is because I'm with you. I think like Mithras as a D100 based, you know, game. It's essentially based on the old RuneQuest
yeah,
that I got into in 80. That's an updating of those rules and a development of those rules, if you like. And it does what actually I think RuneQuest 3 actually has those explanations, and actually RuneQuest 2 actually has those explanations about stats, like why. So when we're doing the bonuses for
right,
manipulation bonuses for skills, why is it that it's Dex and intelligence, for
right.
example, and all
So it
those
all
kind of
carries through.
explanations? Yeah, that style carries through, and again, that comes from the 80s. But I think those writers, the design mechanism, the guys there, Pete and oh god, it's gone my head.
Lawrence
Lawrence, yeah,
Whitaker.
just
Yeah.
amazing job of taking that spirit forward in a very practical way. And yeah, it's no surprise to me that I told you in 2016 I picked up Mentz's Red Box, and then I was also reading Mithras, and it wasn't very long before I put the two together. And I started running Mithras with my group using the dungeon from Betme, and then very quickly built what has become what became the Mistamir realm, slightly different spelling,
Right.
and actually got picked up by the design mechanism to invite me to write an adventure for the Mithras Classic Fantasy, which is a supplement for Mithras, set in
Yeah.
that style and play. Now, it's really interesting to me as the person who got kind of picked up as an enthusiastic supporter of the game and then got invited to write a dungeon for it, that what was happening at the same time was I was returning to those classic roots and methodology. and it matches really beautifully with that game system. So yeah, I hear what I absolutely echo what you're saying in terms of all the modern games out there.
Right.
There are very few that teach you how to play and how to adapt your rules to fit the world you want and get the effect that you want. And of course now classic fantasy, if you're into that style, sitting here listening to this and you want to play with Mithras, you go and get the classic fantasy imperative, which came out
Right.
just a few weeks ago, which has the core game rules of Mithras blended with the classic fantasy stuff that has been written for, beautifully, amazingly written for that whole game,
Yeah.
essentially for free.
Yeah.
So and then you
It's
can go and
mind
buy a
blowing.
classic fantasy book. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
again, Rod, who is a friend now, invited me to write, but he's done an amazing job of taking that original. I loved D&D, but I really hated D&D. I loved the kind of fantasy that D&D offers me, first edition and second edition. He tends to be first edition style, and then second edition he uses as a sort of basis for mechanically translating things into D100.
Right.
But he's the guy who loved D&D, hated D&D, and loved RuneQuest and D100 BRP, and wanted to bring those two things together, and has done so. And if you haven't checked out Mithras Classic Fantasy, then Classic Fantasy Imperative is your product. And I know I am not being paid to say it. But
Yeah.
we,
But
I
that's
mean,
true.
it's 18 months ago, we were play testing some of that stuff, and we had so much fun with it. And it's only as GM of that particular session, it's only my like personal failings and well-being that got in the way in the end, because we'll have dark times, right? So actually we had so much fun with that game, because yes, you're right, it's doing the same thing that those older games did, which is providing this flavor of fantasy gaming that's easy to pick up and run with, and sort of can adapt to any sort of style, and at the same time doing that with this very much better, more organized, well explained set of rules. I say better in the sense of just being more detailed and richer, I guess. For me, I prefer that. I like GURPS
Right.
after all.
But also navigable. You can
Yeah.
where stuff is in the book.
Yeah, I mean,
All
I've
right.
got like basically, I'm going through culling my shells, and there's basically a top 3 games, and my top 3 games include Mithras. So it is a very, very good game.
Yeah. Yeah. As I have been spending the last few weeks stepping back into classic BRP, the
Mm.
Call of Cthulhu flavor,
Mm-hmm.
from the 5th to 6th kind of
Okay.
era. It's been really fun, making me really hungry for doing Mithras stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
also it's like putting on your favorite jacket, like the seasons have turned and you can finally put the right coat on and
Yeah,
everything.
I've just been spent. Some guys have asked me, because a conversation happened in our Roleplay Rescue Discord the other week, which was basically the guys. I wasn't involved at first, but the guys were going, I've heard it said that you can play like ducks and baboons in RuneQuest. Is this true? And then, of course, I ended up chipping in with, well, yeah, of course you can, because you can play any of the
Anything,
monsters
yeah.
at the back of the book. Pretty much, oh, not all of them, but most of them are statted in the same way as characters. So you essentially know what to roll them up, and you've got all the other stats. Everything is built using the same kind of structure. It's not like in actually classic D&D where the monsters have a completely different stat
Right.
structure, to the player characters. So RuneQuest and all the BRP games have that, the same 7 stats, is it? I can't remember off the top of my head, but those 7 stats. Anyway, that led
Right.
to a conversation of like, oh, we could play on Monday nights again. And I'm like, yeah, maybe we could. And then we've got to the point where maybe we could play some RuneQuest, because we'd like to play baboons and ducks, please. So we are taking baboons and ducks to Griffin Island with RuneQuest 3.
Right.
Now, I've got
So
this
that
really horrible feeling that I'm going to play RuneQuest 3 on Griffin Island for a few weeks, and then I'm going to very rapidly feel like, can we just do this with Mithras?
Yeah.
And I'm going to end up going like Mithra, like RuneQuest 3 is great. Don't get me wrong. It's like 96-page Games Workshop British edition of that I've got. Which has got the core rules and is really nice. It's like just stripped down. Grantha's gone, unfortunately, or maybe
Right.
fortunately, when you look at it. I'm going with Griffin Island, not Griffin Mountain, because we don't want to play in Grantha. But I do want ducks and baboons. Now, ducks are in the back of that book, but baboons aren't. So I'll nick the baboons out of RuneQuest 2 because I can do that.
Right.
And then we'll play. But I know that if I go to Mithras, I can use those same flipping stats actually. So even if ducks and baboons aren't in Mithras, I can't remember if they are. I think baboons might be, but ducks aren't. But I imagine the stats aren't going to be all that different because ultimately that BRP engine, you can like mix and match. And I know I could take stuff out of my Call of Cthulhu set and do and put them into
Do the same thing. Yeah.
game, all the stuff.
Yeah.
So, and I love that about that game. So I think, like, again, though, my point was that I know that if I play with the old edition of RuneQuest, there often comes, I've had this before a few times, but there always comes this point of like knowing Mithras is out there. I always end up with the question in my mind of why am I not going to Mithras? The usual answer, by the way, is simply because Mithras's combat system is so much more detailed and therefore a little slower at the table. That
for a period of time.
Yeah, that actually, if you've only got 2 hours or 2.5 hours online game time, then that can, a fight can take you your evening. And I know that like using the stripped down RuneQuest 3 is going to be a bit quicker.
Yeah.
But there's nothing to stop me, by the way, using Mithras and just not using some of the options that are in there, because it's basically, it would be a lie to say you couldn't just use the core roll to hit and ignore the special effects, for example, which add an enormous degree of richness to the game, I have to say, and you should absolutely use if you can. But it's just like you could just ignore those and just go with the hit point damage, like in the old days,
Yeah.
And while we're on the subject of talking about being BRP, I guess we ought to mention in passing that there's a new BRP book, right?
Right.
Which I've also got. So it's been republished, guys.
That's true. And it has been adjusted somewhat.
Yeah. My only problem with it is it completely fails to tell you how to play the game, really.
It's lacking that kind of advice that we just talked about was being present in Mithras. Yeah.
I'm not sure that's entirely fair, but it doesn't have that broken down. It's got all the options for playing like any kind of game you want, whether it's investigative horror, fantasy, or science fiction, or whatever you want. All those options are in there, and it'll talk you through like that. But also, it does come with two things. It comes with the assumption that you're going to be playing a narrativist approach to gaming, that story-based, focused, kind of game, not like a more traditional SR kind of open world game.
Right.
It doesn't have any advice around that. And the second thing to say is it doesn't really have much advice beyond like get them to roll some characters. You come up with some scenes and then you run those scenes. It doesn't give you structural advice, which
right, like how to start your first setting, or how to build a world, or that kind of stuff. It's a toolkit.
Yeah, it's a toolkit set, and it's a gorgeous toolkit set. But it is still like so many things. It lacks the methodological guidance. I mean, even my favorite game in the world, GURPS, lacks methodology deliberately. I've talked to the creators of that game, and they're like, "Yeah, we didn't want the fourth edition of GURPS. It's just basically a toolkit of rules. It doesn't tell you how to run a game. That's deliberate. It's not prescriptive. It's descriptive." And and I guess that's fine as long as you know how to run a game. But to bring this like full circle, if you're introducing someone to, again, it's another reason why I would not initially take GURPS to the club, because it doesn't, if I give them the rule book, it doesn't tell them how to run an adventure or game.
You're just creating more questions that they don't have the experience to answer.
In fact, it's a massive toolkit of rules that they'd have to, it's a subtractive approach. Like GURPS, you need a subtractive approach. The same with BRP core rulebook. You'd need to take a subtractive approach. Of what don't I need? I don't need the gun rules. I don't need I don't need the rules on superpowers. I don't need the rules on even maybe on magic. Or if I'm going to use magic, which of the X number of magic systems am I going to use?
I only need one magic system, or I only need two.
And of course, for newbies, that's totally going to poison the well. So that's why I didn't take that to school. That's why I wouldn't take BRP to school.
Right.
And even with Mithras, to be fair, you'd still have to do a little bit of that because you've got 4 magic systems, I think.
5.
5, and if you count the one from Classic Fantasy, 6.
Right.
Then, so I mean, oh my god. Anyway,
That's
but again, like you could use them all, and they're all compatible as well, which is a glorious triumph for that system.
It is.
But in reality, you might want 2 of them in your game.
For genre reasons.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is we're playing one game like Star Wars or whatever, and I'll see someone is interested in game mastering, and I'll slip them a copy of the Mithras rules and say, we'll talk about this later. And
yeah, but I will come back to the giving them a rule book rarely works thing that you said earlier. I think in the end,
we have to talk. Yeah,
I think that one of the things I'd like to propose, that maybe out of this conversation, because just sitting here talking about it, I've realised this. We need to do more of saying to people, "Why don't you come and sit at my table and co-GM with me?" I think we need to do that more.
I think so.
And if we are playing online, like saying to someone, "You're going to be a co-GM with me," and they're going to need to like message each other or occasionally, like, I don't know, maybe we even need to use the separate rooms thing or something, but or maybe we need to meet before session. A coached or mentored approach to this is something I think the hobby desperately needs, especially if it's true and there is a shortage of GMs.
Right, if that is indeed true, and sometimes it feels like it, but
when you're a GM, it doesn't.
I don't notice then. Yeah. Or at very least, if we're not going to do that, at least be willing to interact with each other about the session that we have just run or getting ready to run.
Yeah, I do think it's worth saying to someone, like, if you really want to do this GM thing, there's an element of like commit yourself to that path and saying, I'm going to move myself towards running a game. So maybe one of the early steps in that is these discussions, but actually there comes a point where I actually think, like, no, come co-GM, like, come be like. There's a wonderful tip I picked up. I can't remember where from. I'm just desperately trying to rack my brain to remember. But the idea of getting someone to play the adversary in a game, so like you're GMing a game, and when it comes to a combat scene, then you have a co-GM run the NPC monsters or whatever you want to call them, right?
Yeah, I've been doing that
as
for
the
decades.
Adversary. Yeah. Now that's a great thing to do, and that's a great first step for anyone who's learning to GM, because they can sit with you and have some access to behind the screen. And when it comes to the fights, they can actually role play those NPCs, and you as a GM can actually adjudicate a lot more detached style. It really changes the dynamic of your table as well. But it is a great learning experience for the neophyte.
I totally agree.
On their feet.
Although I have an infamous or famous video on my channel called "The Worst Session Ever," which is when I was doing exactly that, but I was doing it with people who'd never experienced it before, and they thought that the extra people in the room were going to be playing normal characters and be allies or whatnot, and when they turned out to be it was a huge mass combat that we've been building up to for quite a while, and I just needed extra help, so they came and we're going to play, and it did not go well. It was the worst session ever, but I still stand by the technique.
Was that a matter of expectation setting then?
Totally. The culture clash expectations. I didn't explain anything. It didn't even occur to me to explain. These people are here as game master assistants. Don't look at the men behind the curtain, kind of thing.
Yeah. So, and that was an important thing to say about the school club thing I was talking about earlier. Is that when this particular player comes behind the screen with me, I said to the players, like, okay, so X person here is basically jamming along with me and learning. So don't mind them. And I think, like, when we get back, I'm probably going to do some of the adversary stuff. I'm probably going to say, like, if he isn't yet confident enough to go and run his own game, it will be a case of saying, right, we'll start taking more and more of of what I'm running without completely ceding the GM seat, because I don't want to lose the game. But to say, like, if they get into a fight scene or whatever, I'm going to go, yeah, you run the monsters. And again, it's that communication expectation at a table thing. And it's easier with neophytes because they think it's all part of the game anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. All right.
So
Well, this has
that any
been
use then?
this has been awesome. I got all kinds of memories coming back, and I'm even more jazzed to get into Mithras a little bit in the future. Although I'll be going through the rivers of London before I get to Mithras, which is an even more stripped down version of BRP, which I'm really excited to get to try. But we've got this detour through Call of Cthulhu first, which has been surprising and fun. But anyway, thanks for taking time out of your holiday to come chat.
Okay. And, you remind me, I need to get my 2nd edition Call of Cthulhu box out.
That's right.
So I got that. Was it last year? I think that arrived.
Last year. Yeah. Did you get the 1-inch or the 2-inch box?
It's the 2-inch one.
There you go.
Extra stuff. And that's because, like, 7th edition Cthulhu, I have never played or run really. And when 7th came out, I trusted Mike, because Mike Mason I used to work with many years ago at Games Workshop. So I trusted him so much that I actually got rid of my 5th and my 6th edition Cthulhu when 7th came out. And then there are some things about 7th edition that are different. So
yeah. Well, it's what we were talking about before with the shift in focus between story as product, story as byproduct. And so if you're shifting into 7th edition, then you're embracing the notion of story as product. And there's tools in there that let you do that.
The 2nd edition is very much coming from having reread it. And I had a conversation with Justin Alexander about it I'm passing in an interview we did some months ago, but it was a thing of, like, actually you can really see in that 2nd edition of Call of Cthulhu where there's still this figuring out how to do investigation, horror gaming, and explain it to people thing, when the background was fantasy. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's fascinating just to read the product from that point of view, because, like, the first example adventure is very much a location based.
The corporate house.
The other one housing, kind of adventure. And then the next one isn't like that. And it's interesting to see that evolution through Call of Cthulhu. Because again, it comes from that 1980, 81 era of separating itself from the D&D way of doing things as it was back then.
Yeah.
I love history.
Yes, me too. And that is a discussion we'll have to shelve for another day, because if you get me started, we'll just never stop.
There's that in time.
There's time. All right. Well, take care. Bye. Stay healthy. Maybe the next conversation we can get into maybe that divide, that rupture in gaming culture between playing with the story and playing for the experience.
Oh my gosh.
Or maybe not.
Terrifying thing. Terrifying to unpick. Anyway, thank you very much for having me on.
My pleasure. Take care. You've been listening to the Casting Shadows podcast. Details about where to find more Casting Shadows can be found in the show description, as well as links to finding the tremendous material produced by our guest, Jay Webster. If you find you'd like to comment on past, present, or future episodes, details of how to contact us to leave a voice message through SpeakPipe are also provided in the show notes. This episode has been lengthy, and I hope interesting and maybe entertaining. Until the next time, take care.